All right, and hello and welcome everybody. My name is Lizzie Bowden. I'm the Adult Services Manager at the Hinsdale Public Library. And this event is Social Media Accessibility Basics, which is presented by the Hinsdale Public Library and the Hinsdale Chamber of Commerce. So with no further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our presenter, Mark McCarthy. Mark McCarthy is a Senior Accessibility Engineer at the University of Illinois System Offices of Administrative Information Technology Services, and he is primarily responsible for ensuring the accessibility of university applications and services, providing assistance and guidance where necessary. In addition, he also works directly with several campus units to assist in accessibility testing and remediation work, and he provides training to other departments and units, and serves on the advisory committee for the IT Accessibility Liaison. And he's also an instructor for Urbana-Champaign's Information Accessibility Design and Policy Certification Program. He is an Illinois Certified Professional in Information Accessibility Design and Policy, a Certified Professional in Web Accessibility from the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, is a member of the W3C ARIA authoring practices and working groups, working with colleagues internationally to promote accessibility, equity, and inclusion. And his areas of interest include gaming accessibility, social justice, inclusion, and advocacy, and user-focused design. So he is very knowledgeable, and we're really grateful that you could take the time to present to us tonight, Mark. And then just as far as questions go, if you have any, please feel free to ask them during the presentation. Mark will be keeping an eye on the chat, as will I. And also, of course, there will be time for questions at the end. And so then with no further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Mark. Thanks.
Thank you, Lizzie. I'm very impressed you got all those acronyms correct. There are a lot of them, and they are never easy to rattle off like that. So kudos to you. As Lizzie mentioned, this is going to be a presentation on social media accessibility basics. So let's see, make sure I'm on the right monitor. So what I have planned for us tonight is to go over a few things. So first, we are going to discuss sort of in very broad strokes what defines disability. You're here, which is an excellent start, but I understand that some folks may or may not be as familiar with disability or disability culture and language. So I always make sure to include a little bit of that in presentations that I give. So we'll go over language, some facets of inclusive design, what it means to consider accessibility versus accommodations versus inclusion, and some fast facts that may or may not be helpful to you in your various positions. This is a little bit of a new something I'm experimenting with, but I think it's really helpful to sort of contextualize why accessibility is important and sort of the background of disability in the US. After that, we're going to go over WCAG, or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, really super quick, really lightning fast, and not in any super duper in-depth way. I could make a whole hour-long spiel about WCAG if I wanted to, and probably not even cover all of it. So I will get you introduced to that, so at least you're a little more familiar with what it's about and where to look for things. And then we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of today's presentation, talking about social media accessibility.
Hey, Mark, we're having some problems with your microphone, just a heads up.
Of course, Zoom. Let me switch it. How's this one? Is that one better?
That's a lot better. Yeah, thanks.
No problem. So going to talk a little bit about why social media accessibility matters. So some of that is particularly like the whys about why we're doing this, besides it being the right thing to do, some things that are going to matter to the marketing folks and the social media managers among you, as well as how it plays into community building, socializing, and thinking about what that means in COVID times and beyond. Then we're going to get into platform best practices, which I'm sure is a lot of the stuff that most of you are going to be here for. It's a fair warning that it's going to be non-exhaustive. So there's a lot of different things you can do, and every platform is a little bit different. I chose to cover Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram for today, which should get you a really good foundation for things to do and behaviors you can carry across to other platforms. And then we're going to talk a little bit about accommodation statements. This is usually something that's more for document accessibility more than anything else, but I think it will be helpful for social media as well. I will summarize all of that kind of like I did now, because that's going to be, it may as well be 2 days from now. So I will summarize everything, and then hopefully there'll be some time for Q&A. But as Lizzie said, please make sure to put questions in chat. I like to answer them kind of as I'm going, so that way it's fresh in your minds.
and mine. So don't be afraid to just throw them in the chat. I will find them and I will try and get you an answer as we're going. So to get started, if you are sort of new to working with disabled folks or disability culture and things in general, the Americans with Disabilities Act defines disability or a person with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. The ADA also makes it unlawful to discriminate against a person based on that person's association with a person with a disability. So thinking about that, there's probably going to be a lot more people than you think in the world and the US that live with disabilities. About 15% of the entire world's population, which is about 1 billion people, live with a disability, at least one. And that number, after I actually looked it up, I was kind of surprised and it really put it into context for me, even though I am a person with disability and I've been working in it for a while. That's more than the entire population of Europe. So that's a lot of people.
Oh, wow.
The CDC estimates that about 26% of Americans, that's about 1 in 4, probably more than that, live with a disability, and that number is 10 times the size of New York City. It's important to remember that if someone identifies as a person with a disability, they may have one or more disabilities that affect their lives on a daily basis. As you might expect from those numbers, disabled folks are the world's largest minority group. And as such, they also tend to spread out between every other minority group as well. And finally, it's not a bad word. Don't be afraid to say disabled or disability. There's a lot of other cutesy sort of words for it that most people tend to find offensive. But yeah, just say that someone's disabled. It's completely fine. So with that, talking a little bit about language, there's something called person first language, which tends to be sort of the most popular way that a lot of folks that are not part of the disabled community or that are in academia or other sorts of public facing positions tend to use. So this might be some language that you're familiar with. So something like person with a disability, an individual with epilepsy or an intellectual disability, person who is deaf, blind, or hard of hearing, individual who uses a wheelchair or a cane, or person who has depression, ADHD, etc. I do want to give a quick shout out to my good friend Lindsay Heights for coming up with these next couple slides before I continue. Sort of what a lot of disabled folks and people in the disability community are pushing for, though, is identity first language. So this kind of ties back to that concept that it's not a bad word. It's okay if you might refer to somebody as a disabled person or a deaf person or an autistic person. It kind of in the same way that you wouldn't necessarily say something like it all the time, person who is Black or person who is gay. You would say gay person, Black person, etc. There's more ways to refer to people depending on what they like to use. And there's always going to be some exceptions. So I like to think of this a lot as how you would interact with folks that are in the queer community. You are more than welcome to ask, if you are in a position to ask, how would you like to be referred to, or how would you like me to address you? That's totally fine. If you're referring to the broader community, a lot of folks these days tend to prefer disabled community rather than people with disabilities, being that it's the default language for a lot of folks. And you want to make sure that you're paying attention to what the folks that you're talking with or to are using, not their parents, not their allies, not their friends, the people themselves that you're talking to. With a lot of this, as I mentioned about it being similar to talking with queer folks, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to how someone is actually referring to themselves. So if you do happen to say disabled people and someone says, well, I don't refer to myself that way, or I don't identify that way, it's totally fine. One of those things, again, just kind of say like, sorry, let me correct myself. How would you like to be referred to? Something like that. Just kind of be aware that there are going to be some differences, especially as a lot of it depends on sort of age and generation and sort of a lot of taking back of various words and language. But basically, same rules apply. As long as you're respectful and kind, it's usually going to be fine. So when we were talking about definitions, you might have seen major life activities, and you might be thinking that's not really a term you've heard of before, but it probably encompasses a lot of things that you might think of. So that's things that are like, not limited to, self-care, eating, hearing, breathing, walking, a lot of things like that. Anything that you might use to sort of get about your life on a day-to-day basis. And if you're thinking that that kind of sounds familiar, the definitions and sort of major life activities and impairments, that sounds familiar to a time when you broke your arm and like you couldn't use it, or you had to use crutches for a little while because you broke your foot. It's exactly right. A lot of disabilities might be permanent, but there's a lot also that are temporary or even situational. So what we mean by that is something that a permanent disability might be someone who only has one arm, but a temporary disability that would affect you in the same way as if you had broken that arm. And a situational one that might affect you in the same way as if you had to be carrying a baby or carrying a big bag of groceries, something like that. All three of those people are going to have the same experience of only being able to use one arm to do the things that they need to do. So while we think about accessibility and accommodations today, it's important to remember that they're necessary for a lot of people, but good accessibility can really benefit everybody. This kind of ties into the social model of disability, which says that it's not someone's condition or someone's particular circumstance or someone's medical diagnosis that's limiting them. It's society that's limiting them. The barriers that society puts in place. So stairs into a building, for instance, those are the things that cause the disabling effect. It's not the person themselves. So that's a really good way, I think, to look at disability a lot of the time, and can kind of help to better inform the way that you're thinking about the sort of accommodations you're making or the different posts you're making in the context of today's presentation, things like that. So thinking about that, that brings us a little bit to thinking about differences of accessibility, accommodation, and inclusion. So the way that I tend to think about it is that if an accommodation is something you can do to make something accessible to somebody, then you can just make something accessible out of the bat or right off the bat. Accommodations tend to be a little bit of a band-aid and solve a problem for one particular person, whereas making something accessible can solve problems for everybody. And as you work on getting things accessible, that's where you start to create a culture of inclusion. So there's a picture on the slide right now. The picture on the very left shows a boy looking over a concrete fence, a small girl who can't see, who has her arms up, and a person in a wheelchair who also can't see over the fence. So that's equality. Everyone has the same experience. The fences are the same height for everybody. But as you can tell, the small girl can't see over the fence and the person with a wheelchair can't see over the fence either. So if we start accommodating those needs, the boy can still look over the fence just fine without any sort of accommodation necessary. But we gave stairs to the girl so that way she can look over the fence, and a ramp to the person in the wheelchair so they can look over the fence. But that's not really treating everybody the same. That's still putting in different supports and accommodations that are enabling their access, but it's really not an inclusive experience for everybody. If we really wanted to make it inclusive, we could take away the concrete fence entirely and put in a chain link fence. So that way all three of those people can see past the fence and we don't have to do anything else to make that experience accessible to them. It's inclusive to everybody, no matter what. So thinking a little bit about some more fast facts as far as the US is concerned. A lot of this is going to be related to the US, and a lot of these numbers that I'm going to be talking about might be underreported based on who's generally associated with being part of the disabled community, what different cultures within the US associate with a disability, if there's a stigma about disability. So that's something to keep in mind, and definitely something to keep in mind with CDC statistics as well, because there might be a lot of mistrust in people about medical institutions collecting data. There might be mistrust in communities about governmental folks coming in. There might be stigmas against particular folks saying that they have a disability. So some things to be aware of as you're thinking about statistics and numbers. Nonetheless, I think they're very helpful. These were collected by Cornell University, and these are for the most recent numbers, which were 2018. So these numbers might be a little bit higher now, but are probably going to be about the same. So the percentage of working age folks with disabilities that are actually working full-time or for a full year is about 24%. And that's versus about 61% of the abled population. All of these are going to be against the abled population. With that number, the poverty rate of those working age people tends to be about 26% versus 10% for the abled population. The percentage of those working age people with disability in the US, those that only have a high school diploma or its equivalent is about 35% versus a much lower 25% for abled folks. Those with some college or what would be an associate's degree usually, so about 2 years of college or so, is about 32% or versus about 30% for abled folks. And then it gets a lot more striking when you start seeing who's actually able to complete college. So those with a bachelor's degree or higher, people with disabilities, only 15% of them have a bachelor's degree or higher, and that's compared to about 35% of abled folks. There's a lot of reasons for that I won't necessarily get into today, but still something to think about as you're thinking about who's actually needing a lot of the accessibility work that you're hopefully going to be doing. And the median income for those households that include any working age people with disabilities in the US is about $47,000 a year versus $74,000 a year for abled folks. So just kind of above working class and being able to live comfortably. So thinking about that, that gives us a little bit of contextualization for why it's important that we need accommodations and a more inclusive sort of society in general. So I like to think about these as like carrots to the process. There are certainly some sticks that we can use and laws and other scary things. But when you start thinking about things as far as who's actually affected by various different disability categories, it gets sort of a lot easier to contextualize that. So all of this is based on a base population of about 300 million people and about a 3 million or so sample size. So those people that about have, let me start that again. The amount of people that have disabilities in the US is about going to be 12%. So that's any of them. And that's going to be about 40 million people. Of those that identified as having a visual disability, so that'd be things that affect how well you can see or if you can see at all, is about 7.5 million or about 2.3% of the sample population. Those with hearing related disabilities, kind of like myself that have auditory processing issues, or if they have deafness or otherwise hard of hearing, is at about 11 million people, which is about 3.6%. Those with ambulatory disabilities, so this would be things that are either someone needs to use a wheelchair, or if they use a cane, or if they have any other sort of fine motor or dexterity related disabilities, it's going to be about 20 million people, which is going to be about 7% of that population. Those with cognitive disabilities, this is things like ADHD or dyslexia, depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, things like that. It's going to be about 15 million people at about 5%. Those that have issues with self-care tasks, so that'd be things like cooking or bathing yourself or making sure that your house is in order, things like that, about 8 million people. So that's about 2%. And those that have more issues with independent living, so things like managing finances or living on your own, is going to be about 15 million people, that's 6%. Those that answered this survey were asked to choose, I think, the one thing if they had to pick one that affects them, but they certainly could have more than one of these at any given time. And again, this could be different based on someone's particular circumstances, what they have access to monetarily as far as getting accommodations for themselves or various assistive technology, things like that. So to think about that a little bit, there's a lot of big numbers, and it's really hard a lot of the time, I think, for most people to really put those big numbers into context. So I thought that this would be a good way to do that if we started comparing it to populations of cities again. So those with visual disabilities, again, that's anything that, so like color blindness, low vision, anything that affects your ability to see. That number is a little bit less than the entire population of New York City. Those with any sort of hearing disabilities, so if you're deaf or have auditory processing issues, things like that, that's about a little bit less than the population of New York City and Los Angeles combined. Those with motor disabilities, things that necessitate someone using a wheelchair or a cane, or if they have problems with their hands. This one is a big one, and I like this one a lot as far as comparisons go, is about New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Phoenix, and Philadelphia combined. So the 6 largest cities in the US combined are folks that have varying levels of motor disabilities. Those with cognitive disabilities, things like dyslexia, et cetera, are about the size of New York City, Los Angeles, or Chicago combined. So as you might be able to tell, that's definitely a lot of people. And when you start thinking about, of course, it's the right thing to do. We want to make sure that our content is the most accessible. If you have to sort of give that information to somebody that might be new to working on accessibility, or convincing management or higher up, so this is an important thing to do, and like it might delay this project, but we need to do it. These might be helpful things to sort of consider. And it's always something, or always good to remember, that these numbers increase with age, they increase with rates of illness. And as we start thinking about COVID and how that has impacted the US and the world, those numbers are probably going to be a lot higher in a few years. So of that total, again, 40.5 million people, that's 4 times the size of New York City. It's a lot of people. So getting a little bit away from contextualization, of course, it's important that we accommodate for people's needs, that we make sure that we're going to have the most accessible sort of content and everything for everybody. But how do we do that? So a lot of that is where the web content accessibility guidelines kick in. The web content accessibility guidelines are developed in cooperation with individuals and organizations around the world, with the goal of providing a single shared standard for web content accessibility, and soon probably to be more, that meets the needs of individuals, organizations, and governments internationally. And that's from the World Wide Web Consortium's Web Accessibility Initiative. The acronyms don't go away, they just get worse. So a lot of what WCAG covers is, as it says in the name, web content, but you can kind of apply WCAG to various different forms of content or instructional media, or even physical spaces, depending on how you want to construe it. They're very useful in contextualizing a lot of that. So as I mentioned in the beginning, WCAG is a very complex document. It's very long, it's very technical. And I wanted to make sure that I could include some very basic information for you all, so that you had a sort of base understanding of what WCAG is and sort of what a lot of the terms in it mean, without going through it in depth. Like I said, I certainly could do that, but that on its own would take a really long time to do. So hopefully in 150 words or less, I'm going to try and give you a really quick primer on WCAG and sort of how to better interpret it. So as you're looking at a lot of WCAG success criteria, that being sort of the goals of what should be accomplished by your content, or content you're evaluating for accessibility, you might come across 2 sort of versions that are really popular right now, which is WCAG 2.0 and WCAG 2.1. They're both stable, and they're both completely referenceable technical standards. Each of them have about 12 to 13 guidelines, which are each sorted under 4 main principles of what WCAG is and why it's important. You might see a lot of links on this slide, and probably a lot before. The slides will be provided to you, so don't feel like you have to write all this down, or you have to remember it all right now. You can read through this all at your own time later on. Links will be provided that go to each of these things. Those 4 principles of how we divide WCAG guidelines are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So thinking about those really quickly, they're kind of self-explanatory, but if you think about them, perceivable is referring to how well can you actually perceive the content you're using. So can you see it? Can you hear it? That kind of thing. When we talk about operable, we're talking about, okay, you can see it and hear it, that's great, but can you use it? Can you use your keyboard to actually interact with it? Can you talk to your computer if you can't type and have your computer do things with it? Is it operable? Is it understandable? So these are things like, you can see it, but can you actually comprehend it? Is it written in such a way that there's not a lot of jargon? Is it written to your reading level? You might think about that like scholarly articles. A lot of academic articles and things like that are written at a very high level of understanding that require certain levels of education. We could get into why that's ableist or not. That's a different topic. But thinking about that as far as, is it understandable or not? Is it going to be easily understood by somebody that's coming to read your content, or in this case, get information about the things that you're posting online? And finally, is it robust? So this is a little more complicated, but it basically means, is it formatted in such a way, or is it designed in such a way, or is it coded in such a way that it's not going to break easily? Is someone able to access it with the tools that they like to be able to use it? This matters a lot more for sort of programming standards. So this would be things like, does it work with, if someone uses JAWS, which is a screen reader for Windows, if someone likes JAWS and uses JAWS, can they use JAWS with it? And you're not forcing them to use something that they don't know how to use. You're not forcing somebody to use Firefox if they like using Chrome, that kind of thing. So within each of those guidelines that are under each of those principles, so that's where we start finding the things that are called success criteria. So those are the actual things that you're going to sort of look at as far as testing goes, or as far as does our content, or does our website, does our audio, video, media, things like that, do they meet these certain things to be able to pass? And those criteria are then further subdivided into 3 different levels: A, AA, and AAA. Both WCAG 2.0 and WCAG 2.1 have all of these features in them. WCAG 2.1, as it might indicate, is backwards compatible. So in general, WCAG is primarily intended for web content developers. So that's, page authors, site designers, etc. Web authoring tool developers. So that would be folks that make things that let you actually make other things. So like Google Docs and stuff like that. Web accessibility evaluation tool developers, so things that I use for my job on a daily basis. And then the thing that's going to matter to you is others who want or need standards for web accessibility, including mobile accessibility, which is new in WCAG 2.1. It's really important to know that, especially as you're starting to sort of read into a lot of WCAG and sort of learn about it for yourself, it is a technical standard. It's not an introduction to accessibility. This is that introduction to accessibility. But if you go to it, don't expect it to necessarily hold your hand and tell you exactly what everything means. It does assume that you have a certain level of understanding, or at least a certain level of Google foo to be able to figure things out. But if you don't have any of that knowledge, that's completely fine. The Web Accessibility Initiative provides, as new, I think, as of WCAG 2.1 also, they provide a list of personas. So sort of example template people that have X disability, where you can sort of think about, well, how does this affect Kevin? Kevin has these disabilities. These are the things that are going to matter to him from WCAG, as well as some quick testing guides that can help you as you're sort of learning more, or as you're sort of thinking about how does this post fare? Is the reading level for this good? Things like that. They also have a where should I start guide. So this is something where there's a lot of other resources that the W3C provides that they can help sort of guide you to get you a better understanding of how to go through WCAG on your own, or in groups, or sort of talk about it in ways that make sense to you. It's important to know that WCAG 2.1 is the current standard. It was ratified, recommended by the W3C in 2018, but a lot of local governments, state governments, federal governments really have yet to catch up with it. For instance, Section 508, which is sort of one of the big laws that governs a lot of educational materials and institutions and things, only says you have to test and comply up to WCAG 2.0. So as you're kind of looking through things, or if someone is giving you different materials or saying, hey, like I need you to check this thing, it might only say WCAG 2.0. It's a good target to meet WCAG 2.0, but if you can, WCAG 2.1 is the goal. It's going to end up giving you a lot more evaluation tools for making sure that things are good for folks with cognitive disabilities and mobile devices like phones and tablets. A lot of that information wasn't in WCAG 2.0, but it's perfectly backwards compatible. So if you can meet all these things in WCAG 2.1, it's going to work with WCAG 2.0, and you can kind of sign off and still check the same boxes that you would otherwise. A little bit about those different levels, so the A, AA, and AAA. The law only requires that we meet levels A and AA. So there's about 63 success criteria in total. I think there's only 40 something that have to be met by law, and a lot of them are really easy. There's things like, is this text readable? Can you navigate things with a keyboard? Some of them are really simple like that. The AAA criteria tend to be a little bit more difficult to implement. They are also usually things that can cause conflicting problems. So if you implement something that meets this particular AAA criteria, it might break something for this other one, or it might break your compliance for this particular AA criteria. So that's typically why those aren't necessarily recommended. Some of those too, though, are very easy to do. Again, making sure that your color contrast, so how bright something is on a screen, so like white on black, is it above a certain number? And that's usually pretty easy to do. There are some other ones that I think might be helpful in terms of social media work. So there's things about sort of synchronous captioning, synchronous sign language interpreting. I think there's a few AAA criteria as far as that's concerned, but you don't have to meet them. If it fits your use case and you can budget for it and all that kind of stuff, absolutely, please go for it. It's not there to say no. It's just there to say kind of be careful about that kind of thing. Is everybody with me so far? I hope. That was kind of a lot. I didn't expect to talk that much about all this in one slide, but hopefully it is. I don't see any questions though, so I'm going to take that as a good sign. Excellent. So thinking about all of that and sort of everything that we've discussed so far as those numbers of how many disabled folks there are in the US and what WCAG says that we should do, I wanted to talk a little bit about why social media accessibility matters. So again, y'all are here, which is excellent. That shows that you think it does matter and you think it's important. I love that. But as we all might kind of know, there are those that might think that it's a waste of time, that it's a waste of money. We don't have the resources for that. You've probably heard things like that before. So if you do run up any of those, I wanted to give you a little bit more context in your world about why those things or why these things are helpful to actually cover and make sure that we implement. So thinking first about subtitles, captioning, and alt text. I'm going to go into what each of those are in a little bit as we start talking about platform specific things. But these are things that might help sort of marketing folks better understand why these things are important, because I don't think a lot of people know all this. About 85% of Facebook's video, Facebook themselves found in a study from a couple of years ago. We're going to ignore the things that came out about Facebook in the last couple of weeks. They found that about 85% of their video is watched on mute. And that might be because people are watching videos on trains, they're watching them on buses, they're watching them late at night next to a partner who is sleeping, whatever it might be. A shocking amount of their content is watched on mute. Cisco says that by 2022, I've seen this number change a bit and the years sort of change and the percentage not change all that much, so it's hard to say. But Cisco thinks that about 80% of all internet traffic within the next year or so is going to be video. So then about 85% of that is hopefully going to, or is probably going to be watched on mute without any audio. There's a lot of studies out there. One of them by the Office of Communication in the UK. There's a lot more. I do have references to all these at the end of the slideshow too, if you're interested. Many studies conclude that vast majority of people, way more than the total amount of people that are deaf or hard of hearing, use subtitles and captions. I'm sure probably a lot of you use subtitles and captions, and you may not be deaf or hard of hearing at all. I find for me that even when my APD isn't acting up, it's really helpful to have them on meetings and things, because as we can all probably relate to, you kind of zone out during meetings, but then you can just look at the subtitles really quick to see what the last thing that person said was when they ask you a question. Same kind of thing for TV shows. When you start kind of zoning out or whatever, a lot of people tend to use them for that. There's a lot of studies that show that subtitles can aid comprehension, retention of whatever it is that is in that program, language acquisition for English as a second language or second language learners in general, and people's focus on whatever it is that they're watching, whether it's a TV show or a movie or a lecture or recording of an event that was put up, things like that. More people watch entire videos or whatever the media is, watch the entire thing when captions are available, meaning that more people click away from them when they're not. As more people tend to consume media as they're on the move, so this is things like buses, trains, airplanes, etc., and on smaller and smaller and kind of bigger but smaller screens, those captions become more important because you're not necessarily going to be in a place where you can put headphones in or your headphones died or whatever it is. And finally, reach, search engine optimization and engagement numbers actually explode as you have proper captioning in alt text. Google is famous, infamous, notorious, positive version of whatever those words is they rank accessible content much, much higher in their search indexes than if it's not. You might have heard about things back in the day called keyword stuffing, when people would put a whole bunch of miscellaneous text into the alt area of a picture. That was similar to this, but Google filters all that out. Now they rank those things lower. But if you actually have good alternative text that actually describes what that picture is, Google ranks that stuff a lot higher. And the same thing if you have subtitles or captions for your videos, those are all present on a website somewhere. Google and other search engines can index all that. You get higher search rankings when I can actually tell what that video is about and recommending it to somebody. Thinking about this as far as maybe younger generations go, so folks even younger than me, like I'm only 28, but I can definitely say that I've seen this a lot, and you've probably seen a lot too if you've been sort of on any others. As you start looking into social media trends and things, there's meme culture a lot now, right? And a lot of that means that if you can find a good screenshot or whatever, and you can put a caption on it real quick, you're going to get a lot more likes on it, a lot more retweets on it, a whole bunch of bonkers stuff without even really much effort. And that goes for videos and things like that too, or short little clips. When I was researching this, I actually found out that Netflix, to promote sex education, which is one of their shows that they have right now, it's really good. If you haven't watched it, highly recommend it. Their entire marketing for that show is it just has screenshots that are out of context. Things like this, with a girl sitting there looking off into one direction, just saying, "My auntie got eaten by wasps." That's the entire of the marketing online, well, on Twitter anyways, for that show. So a lot of that has kind of shown me, and just sort of thinking about the circles that I'm in and disability sort of communities that I'm in, there's a lot more users today, and folks that are younger than me and things like that. So, you know, like Gen X or Gen Z, users today are much more receptive to brands and organizations and corporations, whatever you want to think of. When they make sure that their content is accessible, people like that. And a lot of people will really flock to that kind of content. And they'll be quick to say their criticisms if it's not. So definitely a really big impetus to making sure that online media is accessible. Thinking about this as far as community and socializing goes, again, it's social media, right? So a lot of disabled people, and this was prior to COVID isolation, tend to face a lot more barriers to social settings and find a lot of community and world building and space building online. So ensuring that the media that you're putting up there is inclusive is going to create better spaces for everyone that chooses to inhabit those. I say that they face more barriers because while there is a lot of emphasis today, I think, on promoting accessibility and making sure that our spaces are accessible when we're building them, and building codes actually coming up to date and things like that, there's still a lot of places that say that they're wheelchair accessible, but they have one step to get into the restaurant. Or a lot of folks don't want to be around bars or other things like that, either for sobriety reasons or for me, because they're loud and they're dark and it's really hard to see people. It's really hard to hear people and understand the conversation. So it's a lot easier to find those spaces online where you can come together instead. As I'm sure we can all relate to, COVID exacerbated a lot of these feelings for a lot of people. And it's really important to know that a lot of disabled people already felt these things and already had experienced a level of isolation, again, due to the disabling effects that society has built up. And a lot of sort of innovative solutions, quote unquote, innovative solutions. So like things like remote working was suddenly, it's easy to do and it's no problem, but people had been asking for that for a really long time. Digital concerts, YouTube live meetups, the list goes on. I'm sure you can think of some. All happened really in large part to mostly able folks realizing and understanding that level of isolation for just a very short amount of time, where a lot of people may have been experiencing that for decades already. So definitely a really big reason to make sure that our social spaces are as inclusive as they can be, whether they're physical or online. There's not a whole lot of data for that. You might be able to guess why there's not a whole lot of data for that as far as how society has historically treated disabled people. And I don't say any of this to shame anybody or to get you into doing this for any shameful reasons or anything. It's really that I myself have benefited a lot from those things happening over this last year or two, and I'd like to see them continue. Digital concerts have been amazing, that I can sit in my office or in my living room and go to a concert and not worry about having to find a bathroom or something like that. It's awesome. So making sure that those things continue is going to be great. I have a quote here that says, "For what might seem like the first time, disabled content creators have leveraged an enormous platform on TikTok and probably other social media platforms, honestly, to build a genuine audience like never before. Influencers with a range of disabilities have tapped into a young and eager audience. Now these disabled creators are using the app to tell their stories in their own words without being forced into the conventional narratives of disability, all while introducing a new generation to a different kind of social media star. They're fighting for representation in a media landscape that has otherwise ignored them." And that's from a really great article that discusses a bunch of disabled creators on TikTok and sort of how they've structured their platforms, things like that. Highly recommend checking it out and reading it. There's some great creators on there too that I think you'd probably really enjoy. But really just shows that even like a lot of like mainstream news outlets are starting to pay attention to that kind of stuff. So now, the moment you've all been waiting for, 40 minutes in. I hope you're still with me. A lot of this stuff is going to go a little bit quicker now that we have some more background. I have some platform-specific tips here, which I mentioned in the beginning. This is not going to be an exhaustive list of tips. It's going to get you a really, really good starting point and a lot of really good skills that you can bring to a lot of different platforms or a lot of different spaces, whether they're physical or not, or sort of even just making, like flyers and things for your office. A lot of these platforms do publish specific help documents, so I encourage you to check those out. The 4 that I have listed here, I've linked to the documents that they have, but really any platform worth its salt is going to have documents to help you out through this, partially because they don't want to get sued, but it's going to help you make better content. So that's all that we care about. So thinking first about Facebook, this being sort of the biggest, most prevalent one as far as pages go, or hosting pictures and event recordings and things like that. A lot of what's going to be discussed as far as Facebook is concerned are things that you can bring other places. So if you get nothing else from this presentation, I hope that this is going to be the best information for you. It's actually going to take a drink really quick before I get into the next bit here. Okay. So all these are going to have various best practices. These are the ones that I came up with about Facebook based on my own experience, based on Facebook's help documentation, and based on knowing what I know about what Facebook offers. So however we all feel about Facebook at the moment, or however your users feel about Facebook at the moment, it's still probably one of the most flexible platforms as far as accessibility is concerned. It allows you to put alt text on your images, which makes those images available for folks that are low vision or blind. They do allow for uploading of your own caption files. They prefer SRT file format, which is sub-RIP template, I think, for their videos. It gives you a huge flexibility of operating system-based accessibility features. So things like making sure someone can zoom, or making sure that high contrast mode is enabled, things like making sure that someone can use a screen reader, or they can talk to their computer to do something. Whatever device that people are using, it's probably going to work with Facebook, whether it's a browser or on an app or a phone or a tablet or whatever. And you can definitely include a ton of really good information on your different posts and different content on Facebook. So the biggest one out of all that is writing good alternative text. And even if you've done this a lot before, I'd like to give you a different sort of method for thinking about how to look at it. So as you're posting pictures on Facebook or whatever platform you're using, or describing them for a website or anything like that, think about how you might describe that picture to somebody over the phone that was calling you for complete context about why that picture is there. So what details are in that picture that are so important that you had to call them, or they had to call you and ask you for a description? But a little bit more than that, how would you give them the entire context of that image without going overboard, so they could kind of get the whole picture about the picture, rather than just what you might think is important about it or what you think they might be asking for? I say this because as someone that's going to be using your site that is low vision or blind, that is relying on a screen reader to audibly tell them what's on the page, you're not going to want to give them just what you think is going to be important. It's best to give them the entire sort of context so they can fully understand and have an equal experience with whatever your content is. Talked about accessible versus inclusive, right? So accessible would just kind of give them the basics about it, whereas inclusive would give them sort of everything they need to sort of see that picture in their mind, again, without going overboard on details. It's usually good to keep these to 2 or 3 sentences. without going overboard on details, but they can still sort of they can imagine what it looks like. They know what the text in the picture says, things like that. Particularly about events. So I think this is maybe the biggest one about Facebook when we're thinking about how to use it. You might be using it for event postings or recordings of events, things like that. I thought about some of this based on my own history of being an intern for our LGBT Resource Center at U of I. And this was probably the biggest stuff that we used it for. If there's something else that you have questions about, definitely feel free to ask. But thinking about events, you want to make sure that you include as much useful information in that event posting as you can. So things like date, time, location, those things might be included in like sort of that event cover photo or any other posting that you have there. So it might be kind of redundant if you already described it in your alt text, but I think it's better generally on social media platforms to have redundancy than to not have enough information. So when you're thinking about those event postings, you want to think about things like all the following. So what time is it? Of course, like a lot of these are going to be kind of basic, but maybe some things you didn't think about. What time is it? Where is it? How can you get there? This is something that I've started to see on a lot of conference web pages, which is really nice. So how can you get there and which side is the main entrance on? So is there a bus stop nearby that somebody can take if they need to take the bus, if they are taking a taxi or Uber or Lyft, if you're in such a city that has those? I don't know that Hinsdale might be. If they're anything like Champaign, maybe not. But if someone's taking that, about how long or how much would that cost? If there's a hotel for the event, is there a shuttle to the hotel? How do you get to the hotel? Can you provide directions for that? Stuff like that. As you start thinking about sort of the more interior or nitty gritty to those events, are there accessible bathrooms in the venue? Is there a spot to take a service animal to use the bathroom if they need to? Some places have special areas inside to do that. Some just have them go outside. Either way, good to know. Is this particular event going to be set free? So if someone has asthma or something like that, is it important to know if it's going to be sent free? Are there content warnings that apply? So if you're screening a movie about World War II, someone might want to know that you're showing something about the Holocaust, stuff like that. Think about those things. Is there going to be live captioning provided? So sort of like we have now, you can advertise that there's going to be captioning at that event so someone doesn't have to ask. It's really nice to see, for me, as someone that likes to have it but doesn't need it, when I just see that it's going to be there and I don't have to ask about it. Is it going to be sort of automated captioning? Is it going to be real-time captioning, or sometimes it's called CART, which stands for Communication Access in Real Time, I think. I always get that one wrong. That's one of the acronyms I always get wrong. But is that going to be provided? So someone actually be typing out accurate captioning. Are there going to be sign language interpreters? Most importantly, I think, more than all of these, is that if you don't have space for enough of this, or if there's just other things that you want to include, or you want to make sure that you're being considerate of other folks' needs, make sure that there's someone specific that they can contact, and specifically how. So you want to make sure that you're giving ideally the most means of access to that person as you can. So you can call Jillian Anderson at this number. You can email her at this email address if you need any help. You want to make sure that it's not something like, like disability@institution.org or some other sort of generic mailbox or sort of committee mailbox. When you can, it's better to direct that to a person who knows that they're going to be asked for help. So they might not have to know how to solve the problem, but they know they're going to be asked for help and they know who they can go to help solve that problem. Kind of talk a little bit more about this when we get to accommodation statements, but that's super important to have for most events. All of this, you don't have to feel like you have to drone on about it. You don't have to provide all this information if it's not super duper necessary, or if it's not necessarily pertinent to whatever it is. Like, you don't have to list, no, there is not a place to take service animals to the bathroom. Someone asks about it, it's good to tell them that, but you don't have to say no. Like, generally these things are like, if yes, then mention it. But including it sort of near the end of your post, if it's not a super duper long post, or putting it in like the first comment, or sort of like a top comment on Facebook posts, that's really helpful, just to make sure that people know exactly what it is that they should be expecting. I included a couple links here. So both to Cornell's accessible meetings guide, which is good for not just sort of like events, so movie screening, but meetings that you might have, departmental meetings and things. as well as a group called SIG Access. They publish an accessible conference guide. These are a lot more sort of in-depth and are more meant for large-scale conferences. So it'd be things like describing the carpet of the venue, specific details about where the bathrooms are, et cetera, et cetera. It might be a little bit overkill for what your particular event is, but my hope in providing them is that it could just kind of jumpstart some ideas or some conversation about things you might want to include for people that are going to be attending your event. So some really quick how-tos. I'll cover these really quick, but I wanted to make sure to just have them in the presentation. So when you get the presentation, you have them readily accessible if you don't want to go to Facebook's article about it. If you want to add captions on a video, you can click on the photo or video on your timeline, on your news feed, wherever you want to post it. You can choose your video, you click post, kind of all like normal. Facebook should let you know once it's uploaded and converted and everything like that. Once it's ready, you can go to the video itself and click on edit video, and then it should have the option for you to upload SRT files, which is going to be your subtitle files. If you have those ready, either from like a third party, or if you wrote them yourself or anything like that, then you can upload them, you can click save, and it'll put them on your video. I'll talk a little bit about how you can make these when we get to YouTube in just a minute. To add alt text to your photos, it's a little bit simpler. So you can go ahead and post your photo. As you're posting it, it should come up with an edit icon. So like that little pencil that's on Facebook. It should probably come up with some automatically generated text. Don't use the automatically generated text. Computers are very inept at understanding what pictures are still somehow after 20 years of captcha work. And so you want to override that and write your alt text in. Click save, go ahead and post it. The process is pretty much the same. If it's a picture that's already been posted, you can go into sort of like the picture options menu, which is like that 3 dots icon, click on change alt text, same procedure, change it, and then click save. As I mentioned, I do have a link here for Facebook's Accessibility Center where they give you these steps verbatim, step by step, and have a couple pictures to show you how. As I mentioned, some things just to kind of be aware of. Facebook and Instagram will automatically produce alt text for you. It's usually bad and awful. Please don't use it. Likewise, Facebook and YouTube will generate automatic captions for you. Don't use the automatic captions either. If you've kind of noticed them as I've been talking, they're not always great and they are not always accurate. They might say that they're 90% accurate, but that's equivalent to getting one wrong word per paragraph on a page of text, per paragraph, per line on a page of text. 95% accurate is one mistake per paragraph. 99% accurate, which is what Wiki says and a lot of other things say, is one wrong letter per page, I believe, or one wrong word per page. A lot of times I like to call those captions because it really makes a lot of sense, because they're really crappy most of the time. So you can use them to help you, but don't rely on them to be beneficial for folks actually needing captioning. So moving on to Instagram, a lot of this is going to be the same. Instagram being focused on photos, you're going to be really improving those alt text skills. So you can find the options for alt text on Instagram underneath the itty bitty, super duper hard to see, really bad contrast, tiny font, advanced settings button, I guess, underneath all the other sharing options. And in there, that's where you can get like the turn off commenting, share to Facebook, that kind of stuff. But then you have this write alt text thing. That's where it's going to provide you a space to write the alt text in your image the same way that you would have on Facebook or anywhere else. I really wish they would put it more front and center. They don't want to do that. If you have any say in providing feedback to Instagram, make sure that they know that it should be more front and center to encourage more people to do that. So again, as you're writing your alt text, these are some things that you'll want to think about. So what's in that photo that you want someone to see, or why is it important to actually have posted it? Especially in relation to your text caption, what is in that picture that's the thing that you want someone to actually get at? If there's anything included in your photo relevant to its context that is not in the caption, you're going to want to make sure to definitely put that in the alt text. So if it's a post about service dogs and you say, congratulations to all of our students on graduating, but it's a service dog class, you might want to say a group of service dogs smiling happily or something like that. Instagram is a little bit more limited in that it's super duper visual. So you might want to kind of be careful and think really sort of critically about what you're posting there and why, and if it might be helpful to have it somewhere else. You may want to consider linking somewhere to somewhere more usable. So like, like Facebook event post or a tweet thread or a Google Doc, something that's going to give someone a little bit more of an easier time getting to that information. Not that Instagram is bad, it works perfectly fine. At least on mobile. I haven't checked it on PC, but I am sure that most people using Instagram aren't really using the PC to look at it that much. But it works very well with the screen reader. I'm not saying that it doesn't. But if you have a lot sort of to convey with that particular post, you may want to consider providing an alternative means to access that information. If you want to revisit those steps, Instagram does provide them. So YouTube is the second most probably beneficial one that we will discuss. And I will try and make this a little bit quick so we got time for questions, but we're almost done. Stick with me, I promise. So this might be something that you want to think of more so as an accessible video section rather than a YouTube section. A lot of this is going to apply to videos in general, not necessarily just YouTube, but I do have a slide that talks about how to do these things on YouTube. So when you're thinking about uploading a video someplace, you want to make sure that it's going to be properly captioned. So again, it doesn't include auto captioning, that whatever the service is going to provide for you, or if you ran it through otter.ai or Descript or anything like that. Those things are generally not going to be acceptable as far as uploading captioned content. But those are a very good place to start, because if it can get it 90% right, that's a lot less that you have to type. Your videos should also have an audio description when you're putting them up somewhere. So you might have encountered this, if you haven't encountered it before, accidentally fiddling with some Netflix audio settings or things like that. So I included some examples here. Someone did a description for the trailer for Frozen, as well as the trailer for Harry Potter 7. These are descriptions that help folks that are low vision or blind that are trying to access the video, and you need to describe what's actually going on in the video and why that's important, and if there's any text on the screen, and a lot of other rules that we don't necessarily have to get into now, but the audio description link on this slide will take you to the site for the National Federation for the Blind, I believe, which talks about this a lot more in depth than I will. But you can get there's a lot of examples that you can get now. Most modern shows on Netflix, due to a lot of lawsuits, thankfully, now pretty much include it. So you can kind of play around with it and see what it sounds like and sort of how people go about things. They're not all going to be perfect, but they are all pretty good. It's important to know that YouTube doesn't allow for multiple audio tracks. So what I've seen a lot of organizations do, and some creators that do this, is if it's a short enough video, or you're making sure that there's enough breaks between somebody talking or whatever it is to have description, then you can just make that the one video so everybody gets that one. If you don't want to have everybody see that one, but you want to make sure it's available, generally the things that I've seen is the same video gets uploaded twice, but the one that does have audio description usually has an AD in the title of it. You could do the same thing if it's captioned, you could do CC. Although YouTube now does differentiate between videos that have captioning and which ones don't, so that's good. Your need for doing that may vary, but just something to be aware of, that you can't have. You might be able to put it on different sites, or sort of like your own computer or intranet with different audio tracks, but can't do it always on platforms. For any live event that you're streaming or hosting in person or online, you want to make sure captioning is provided for that. All of these things do have specifics listed in WCAG, which you can find in the first section underneath the first principle. And WCAG does provide explainers for what each of these things mean, and some different techniques that you can use to actually succeed at what you're trying to do. They don't just kind of throw you to the wolves and say video must have captioning. They do provide explainers to you about, this is what we mean by video must have captioning. This is what you can do to make sure that your video has captioning, among other things. Every success criteria has both of those things in there. I linked you here to a simpler to understand version of WCAG that has those particular links available for you. It's also important to know that these considerations do not apply if and only if the audio or video is an alternative for other text-based media and it's clearly marked as such to the user. So that might be something where the primary piece of media you're trying to get across is an essay, and you have an audio recording of someone reading the essay. That's great. But then that also means that you don't have to caption that audio recording if that text essay is the same, because the audio recording is the alternative version. So there's already an accessible version of that audio recording for somebody to access, if that makes sense. Same thing if it's a video or other things like that. Thinking about video a little bit more in general, this is kind of more be awares, gotchas, things like that. The party responsible for providing all the previous accommodations we discussed is the host. So whoever's actually providing that content, not the user or not the attendee or not the software the user is using to attend that event. So just because Zoom has built-in auto captioning, that's great, but it's the host's responsibility to make sure it's on if someone requests auto captioning, or to make sure that captioning is provided if someone requests captioning. It's not on the user to provide funding for that or staff for that. They might be able to recommend you some people, and it's okay to sort of like work together with people and sort of come to a good agreement. A lot of people like that, but you don't want to say something like, sure, we could do that. Give us an agency and give us the money to do that. Obviously, you probably wouldn't do that, and you can probably see why that's not a great thing, but just wanted to make sure that it's understood that it's the host that is responsible for those things. As I mentioned before, it's really good to work smarter and not harder. So those auto captioning software solutions are not great for someone that needs proper captioning, but they can help you make actually good caption files to upload to Facebook or to YouTube or anywhere else. You can have them automatically generate everything, and then you can go back and make sure that the punctuation is correct, that spelling's correct, if there's any sort of other adjustments that need to be made. And then you can upload that to whatever platform you're using as a more complete caption file. You'll also want to make sure that if you're putting text into your video, that it's not on sort of like, if it's white text, that it's not on a white background, things like that, and that you're not including unnecessary flashing in your videos either, or anything that would cause like a vertigo effect. Sort of like standard things that most people would probably be annoyed with, but folks that have accessibility needs would see that differently. So again, just a real quick for how to do that on YouTube. If you want to create captions on a YouTube video that you've already uploaded, or to have it create captions for you, you can sign into your YouTube Studio account. On the left menu, it should have a subtitles option. You can click on whatever video it is that you want to edit or to add those subtitles to. You click on add language, select the language that you want the subtitles in, probably going to be English for our group. And under subtitles, click add. It should help you generate them if they're not already there. But again, don't rely on those if you don't have to, but it's a good place to start. If you have captions already that you had written out a script for, I know a lot of creators, they'll write scripts for their videos and they'll upload them. YouTube will match them to what they're saying, and then there's just minor adjustments you have to make. So if you have a script already, or if another company made captions for you, you can upload them as long as the file type is supported. YouTube takes well near anything, but SRT again is a really good place to start. You can upload that file. You're going to choose if it has with timing. So that would be if someone has already gone through and matched up and synced up the audio to the words, or without timing. So that would be the script option. If you have a script already, but you didn't match it up, that just tells YouTube if it needs to match everything to the audio or not. Pick your file, upload it, and then just click save. You're good to go. Google provides all this information and a heck of a lot more, frankly, that they don't make as available to people as they should on their help pages. You can definitely check that out to get a recap of all this. And TikTok. I was talking with Lizzie about what sort of the fourth one might be, thinking about just like time constraints and all that. And I think we thought that TikTok might be sort of a good place or a good last one to put in here. It's definitely new. It's definitely got a lot of work to do yet, and definitely is not the only sort of like next big one to include, but because it's more popular, I thought we would include it. So TikTok, as you might know, is super duper popular, and there are lots of users that are super duper interested in non-traditional content. So a lot of things that I follow are libraries, waste management, recycling, trucking industry, urban planning, a lot of other niche content. People use it for all kinds of things. So the nice thing about TikTok is that for the most part, all of those best practices you mentioned for video are going to apply there too. So make sure that you're warning people, or make sure you're not including flashing if you don't have it. Make sure you're captioning your videos as you're uploading them. If something is important and it's only visually represented, make sure that it's audibly described somehow, or you post a comment about it, something like that. And you can use the text to speech option if you're posting something that has a text overlay and no sort of other narrated overlay to it. Very similar to caption TikToks. You can, after you get your video done, you can turn on the auto captioning feature and then edit them to make sure that it's all correct. If you want to turn on the text to speech, you can tap or long press on the text that you put on the video, and it should come up with the text to speech option. If you have flashing in your video, you can set it to include a photosensitivity warning, which if people have it enabled on their apps, they'll skip past it to make sure that they're not affected by it. They do have a blog post about this. It really only mentions these 3 things. Like I said, it's kind of new, and I think they're really trying to figure out what to do because they were not good at this as of like 6 months ago. So they're still working on it, but all this information is in a blog post on their site as well. We are nearly there. It's the last big thing I have to talk about. Accommodation statements, as I mentioned with the Facebook events. So this is really important, I think, if you're making any sort of documents, or if you are putting anything up in your office, anything like that. It's really good practice to include accommodation statements wherever those documents or events might be accessed. So this is, again, where you want to include a specific person. You don't want to include a generic mailbox or a generic phone number that's going to have somebody going through a phone tree or something like that. I did include some examples here. So that might sound something like, if you require any accommodations to more fully participate, please email JillianAnderson@institution.org. For questions about accessibility or to request accommodations, please contact Jillian Anderson at a specific email address, specific phone number. All are welcome. If you need disability-related accommodations, have dietary needs, or other concerns, please contact Jillian at her phone number. These things may not be strictly related to disabilities, so like dietary needs or restrictions, if people have allergies, if they're wondering if there's going to be pets or different scents allowed, things like that. Think about that. The most important thing with this, and I can never stress this enough because sometimes people think it's enough to just put a basic email address down, is just make sure there is a specific person and that person knows that they're going to be contacted. It's really good as someone that does email about those things when I can reach an actual person who is like, yes, I'm the one in charge of that. I know how to fix that. Here's the answer. Or yes, we can do that accommodation. Let me send it in right now. Let me get your information. Or thank you for contacting us. I'll make sure that this gets passed along to who's in charge of it and they will contact you back. Something like that. It's really demoralizing if someone has to go through that phone tree or get just in touch with a generic mailbox, if they're just trying to make sure that they can come to your film screening or whatever it is. So definitely make sure that there's multiple ways to get in touch with that person and that it's a particular person or group. It could be a group, but just try to avoid things that might go to, like 30 different people or something like that. Because it's really easy to say, well, Jane, I thought was going to take care of that. Well, I was going to take care of that. I thought Bob said he was going to take care of that. That kind of thing. So in summary, the biggest things I think that we could take away from all of this is to say, if you're using captions or if you're providing captions on a video, make sure you're providing your own or corrected ones instead of automatically generated ones whenever possible. You can use the automatic ones to create your own after the fact or to make better ones, but don't bother starting from scratch. Use the automated ones to help you. As you're posting about events or any sort of other information, you want to make sure that all the relevant information that people might want, even if it's redundant, again, within reason, I understand that you might have space limitations or design limitations. Make sure that all that information is available to them. When you're providing that alt text on pictures or anything else, think about how you would describe that information to someone over the phone, rather than just giving them what you think they want. You want to make sure that we're giving them an equal experience whenever we can. And as we've learned many times before for many years, and somehow people still do this with not just disability, but race and all kinds of other things, separate but equal is never really truly equal. So get creative with your accessibility remediations. Don't try and send people to something different if they can't access it. think about how you can solve the problems that you're sort of presented with, or the things we talked about, equitably, but with grace and imagination. It's not all just about the extra work or the extra money or the extra time it's going to take. It's about making sure that everyone is equally able to participate in the thing that you're providing for them. That was a lot, I know, but I hope that that was really good information for you all. I have my contact information listed here. You can call me or email me, whatever's easiest for you. If you have any more questions or concerns, or if you know someone in your department that you want me to give this presentation to again, that's totally fine. I'm more than willing to do that. If you want a little bit more than what I gave you here, though I imagine you're all ready to go to sleep right now, like I am. A friend of mine at the UIUC library gave a fantastic talk at our IT professionals forum over the summer about interacting with customers with disabilities. It's from a library standpoint and sort of a librarian patron relationship, but it's really good for anybody in any sort of front-facing role. Microsoft provides a really good and amazing amount of Office accessibility support. This is new, and I just want to make sure to plug it. If you have any sort of questions about Word documents, PowerPoints, things like that, I can present on that too, but that's not what today's about. And if you want to be certified in any of these things, you can look into our IADP program if you want something that's kind of technical, it's not super technical. Or if you are interested in sort of different certifications that the International Association of Accessibility Professionals offers, they offer some sort of more basic and advanced digital and general accessibility certifications. If you're interested, thank you super duper much. I will give it back to Lizzie for right now, and I'm going to stop talking for a little bit. And I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Thanks, Mark. That was awesome. I know I definitely learned a lot. So I haven't seen any questions come through. So I'll give a minute just if anybody wants to unmute or type any. I think you were really thorough though, and you know, a lot of good information. So I'm not, yeah. And of course you provided your information if people do have them. So we'll just give it a sec.
But by no means feel forced to. I understand that it's about 8:30 at night. So.
Yeah. And it's getting dark earlier now than it used to.
Tell me about it.
Feels later than it did a week ago.
Oh my God, I know.
All right, well, in the absence of any questions, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you very much, and I will stop our recording. So let me just do that quickly. And thanks, everybody.